So, in short, the world is a much smaller place than even William Booth thought it was when he set up the Salvation Army's response to global problems in the 1890s. We now live in a truly globalised village. We actually live in a globalised backyard if Twitter and Facebook are to be taken seriously, which many of you do. Here's George Brandis, the current Attorney General of Australia. This is a photograph of George Brandis, Liberal government Attorney General, just a few months ago, giving a speech. He's giving a speech at the Centre for Independent Studies in Sydney. What's he talking about? What he's talking about is the role of Christian civilisation in shaping European and Western values. That is, George Brandis is recognising that there is a values question underlying a lot of what is going on today. And he was asked by the Centre of Independent Studies to do this talk, and he chose to do it on the underpinning of Christian values to the nature of the civilisation we have. That is, whether you are a Christian believer or not, our civilisation has been shaped by a set of values that were formed essentially out of that Christian ethos. Malcolm Fraser died just a few months ago, same week as General Eva Burrows, actually, former head of the Salvation Army. Malcolm Fraser's one big appearance in public in the last 10 years was in Sydney 12 months ago, probably just over 12 months ago now, when he was invited to the nest of left-wing Balmain basket weavers at an event called Politics in the Pub. It was the biggest crowd they'd ever had in their history. In Balmain, the birthplace of the Labor Party, who did they all turn up to hear? Malcolm Fraser. What was his topic? The moral responsibility we have for refugees. What I'm saying is this is a non-party political issue. It's an attitudinal issue. It's about who and what we are and how we respond as people to the world in which we live. For the best part of 1500 years, the church was the central focus of that for all of us. Didn't matter what denomination, you went to church to learn your values. In the last 40 or 50 years in the West, that has begun to break down. It's now breaking down at a precipitate rate. The reasons, we could have a whole lecture on why the reasons are, and I'm sure there'd be a room full of other people, not this group, who would be very interested in unpacking the reasons. But one clear example is technology. Since 1956 and television's arrival, technology has exploded. We're now in the world of tweets, Twitter and Facebook. People no longer need those small closed groups of churches led by parents and authoritarian ministers to tell them the way the world works. You switch on the television, you can find out the way the world works, and if the television's not working, you look at your mate's page on Facebook and they'll tell you how the world's working. We don't need it anymore. We don't need these structures. As a consequence, organised religion, like other organised groups, whether it be political parties or the Lions Club or the Rotary Club, are all crumbling because people don't need them anymore. I don't need to go out to a meeting and sit around with a bunch of boring people. I can get on Facebook and talk to people I like. The trouble is with that in those groups of boring people, we used to actually have to confront people we didn't particularly like and we learned how to get on with them. We're not doing too well at that these days. We're creating our own little closed worlds. The church is just a central symbol of what used to be a way of bringing people together, people that had widely different political and social attitudes, into a common arena where they could talk about values and what the values were. That's breaking down. Christopher Hitchens, one of the great atheists who died a couple of years ago of cancer, now Hitchens was the leader of what they call the New Atheists. You know, he was one of those guys who went around saying, God is dead and it's just as well he's left the room. Well, I'll give you a quote from Christopher Hitchens. There once was a Christian world, he says. It had been partly evolved, partly carved out by the sword, partly defended by the sword, and at some points giving away, and at other times expanding. But, says Hitchens, it was a meaningful name for a community of belief and value that endured for many, many centuries, and has many splendours to its name. But it's all gone. No one could use that term, Christendom, anymore without either great nostalgia or some sense of irony. And it's all gone for a reason. It destroyed itself. Christendom. It destroyed itself by the tremendous criminal act of urging its members to kill each other in the outbreak of the Great War 100 years ago, and as it was then known, but it wasn't known that it would lead to a huge and even worse part two, the Second World War. Where are we now, says Hitchens. So even a leading atheist is acknowledging there's a problem with values. That is, what do we look for to guide us? The American historian Will Durant, that's a book that came out on, not a Hitchens book, by somebody else called Philip Jenkins, I'll refer to later, on the impact of World War I on religion. The American historian Will Durant cast the matter in a bit of a wider context when he observed that religion as an institution, why is it that religion's been important? It says this, that religion begins by offering magical aid to small tribes and harassed and bewildered men. It culminates over many centuries by giving to a people a unity of morals and belief which seems so favourable to statesmanship, to art, to creativity, but it usually ends by fighting suicidally in the lost cause of the past. That's the arc of the way religious traditions usually work. And a lot of people are saying, are we in that situation today with many Christian groups? You look at a country like the United States that people claim built on a Christian tradition, yet many of those Christian traditions in the United States seem more intent on fighting among themselves than they do in advancing the cause of religion. So a lot of people say, why bother? Why bother? I want to go back a little further than Will Durant and his observations about the place of religion in society. He actually became very famous for writing a whole set of books about the history of the world. He was one of those historians who, and you probably don't remember this, but when I was growing up, the great, if you were an aspiring house, the great thing your parents did was buy a set of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. You know, that was the sign that they were on the way, you know, you were rising in the world. If you were in America and you wanted to move on from the Encyclopaedia Britannica, you bought a set of Will Durant. Oh, you've got the Encyclopaedia Britannica? We've got Will Durant. It was very fashionable to have your big set of Will Durant books. The one book of his that's still in print that's terrific, if you want to read it, is called The Story of Philosophy. It's just one of the most readable histories of philosophy that you can get, and still very, very much in use. I've given you that quote of Durant's. We'll move on. Next week is World Suicide Prevention Week. What we have in our society at the moment, despite all the attempts to get around it, is an increasing rate of suicide. So we're not talking about global issues of values, we're actually beginning to talk about things that affect people. One of the profound reasons why suicide rates are increasing is because of a sense of breakdown and alienation. People are alone and distressed. This is one of the things the Salvation Army is doing, actually. If you're aware of it, runs Hope for Life, which is a suicide. It focuses on those bereaved by suicide, but we hope that other people aren't going to do it. And Hope for Life is just one of the agencies that are recognising that there are real issues here that we need to be prepared to deal with. The question of values isn't simply one that's a philosophical question, it becomes a personal question, particularly biting into families and individuals. The meaning of life. Now here's where the history lesson begins. Only a brief one, I promise. Should the church be a principal agent of determining the way we live? Well, irrespective of what you think of that question, it's been a fact of history for the best part of 1600 years. The church became part of shaping the way our society works when the Emperor of Rome, Constantine, in the early 400s, adopted Christianity. And Christianity became determinative in the way the Roman state shaped itself. That is, Christian values began to determine the nature of law and everything else in society. It's a very long history. And it seems, though, that about every 500 years, it goes through a period of disruption. If we take Constantine as, say, being, and the way in which Christianity began to influence the Roman Empire was around, say, 500. Around the year 1000, there was a big split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, and we have the Orthodox splitting off. Every 500 years, things seem to break down. About 500 years later, there was another big split when the Protestants split from the Catholics, and we had what's known as the Reformation, when Martin Luther famously got grumpy with the way the church was demanding money off people to build St Peter's Cathedral in Rome, and went and nailed 95 theses up on the door of the Wittenberg church and said, "These are the corruptions of Rome." Now, the interesting one, and again, history repeats itself, the real objection he had was to a particular Catholic priest called Tetzel, who was running around Europe with the blessing of the Pope, and he was saying to people, look, if you give us a 1,000 denarii or whatever the currency of Florentine currency, give us 1,000 florins, and I'll guarantee you that the Pope will exercise his power so your father and mother and your uncles and aunts will get a guaranteed passport to heaven. That is, because the Pope has the power to forgive sins, you could buy your dead ancestors' way out of hell into heaven. Luther thought this was shonky theology and probably criminal practice. And that was the start of the Protestant Reformation. Yeah, money's at the heart of everything. Luther succeeded, and the churches of Northern Europe and later Britain split away from Rome, and we got the emergence of Protestantism. That's 500 years ago. So you got 500 years after, 500 years AD, Constantine begins religion and politics together. 500 years later, Eastern and Western churches split. 500 years after that, Luther splits from Rome. We're now 500 years on, but before we go there, I want to deal with somebody who actually had an argument with Luther about the nature of the split. And he was John Calvin, and he was a Swiss theologian. Now, I promise this is only going to take a couple of minutes, but it's worth it. It's worth it. There was a big argument about if God rules the world, how much in charge is he? It boiled down to an argument about how much freedom you and I have to choose. Who's free? I can be morally free to make my own decisions? Well, Calvin, who had a bit of an argument with Luther, said, well, actually, you only think you are, because everything's predetermined. God is totally sovereign. He's so sovereign that he knows the beginning and the end. He knows the path your life's going to go, and he knows who's going to be saved and who's going to be damned. So some people will say, well, what's the point? To which the Calvinist response was, well, you wrestle with it. You wrestle with it. You just hope that you're on the right side of the ledger. Well, there were a few people pretty unhappy with that Calvinist response. If I want to summarise the Calvin response, who recalls the wonderful little RSPCA ad on TV from many years ago? All things bright and beautiful. All creatures remember that? All things bright and beautiful. Do you know there's a second verse to that song? You don't hear it anymore. It goes like this. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. That is, if you're rich, get used to it. If you're poor, that's the way God meant for it to be. Now, a few people were pretty uncomfortable with that. And one of the people who was most uncomfortable with Calvin's position, move on, was this man, a guy called John Wesley. He was a very high church Anglican and he loved the early church fathers. And he wondered what holy Christian holiness was. It can't be just this fixed thing because people have to make decisions. And he supported a fellow who had been a strong person who'd argued against Calvin, and he said, look, God is sovereign. As a matter of fact, he's so sovereign, he can decide to suspend his sovereignty and give individuals freedom. Bingo. Wesley says God is so sovereign that he can grant his creation freedom of action. Out of that comes a whole new way of thinking about religion or about Christianity. What Wesley says is you are responsible. More than that, if you're responsible for yourself, you're also responsible for your neighbour. Because all of us are free agents. And God's charge is that we look after each other. And we are the responsible ones. Now, how often have you heard the preacher say, oh, we'll leave it to the Lord, you know? It's difficult. Let's leave it to the Lord. No, says Wesley, your hands, your feet. Responsibility comes back to us. Now, this becomes important in understanding where the Salvation Army begins to fit in all of this, because William Booth was a follower of John Wesley. The other thing that Wesley said that's interesting about all of this is that when Luther and Calvin had split away from the church, what they wanted to do, they had a fight with Rome. So the important thing was to reject Rome and all its authority. And they said the authority of God rests wherever 2 or 3 people are gathered together. There is the church. Now that's a very powerful idea because in fact it allowed Christian missionaries to spread around the world because they could take the church to the poor benighted souls in Africa, India, China, wherever, and they didn't have to worry about what the Pope was telling them to do. They could do it themselves. It became a do-it-yourself Christianity. The best example was in the United States. Christianity spread across the United States and 1,000 churches bloomed. Problem is they all began to believe slightly different things. Wesley comes along and he says, yes, God is sovereign, but he's given us freedom. But Wesley reclaimed something. He said the church is universal. We are all connected. And he had this idea that he called it connectionalism. That we're not just totally isolated little groups dealing with God, that we are part of the body of Christ, universal. There are values that connect us. That connectionalism, that universal nature of the church, is something that Booth also picked up. He picked up 3 things from Wesley. He picked up the idea that all of us are responsible, called the priesthood of all believers. He picked up the idea of we are universally connected. We are all part of a body of Christ. He also picked up something else, that I am responsible for my brother. In wrestling with holiness, this idea of how God expresses himself in the world, Wesley came up with a line, there is no holiness but social holiness. That is, we are connected. We are responsible for each other. You see where I'm going with this. Here endeth the theology, and here we get into the practice. When Wesley lay on his deathbed, he wrote a letter, and I'm talking about the 1780s, 1790s here, and he wrote a letter. Go in the name of God and the powers of his might till even American slavery, the vilest that ever saw the sun, shall vanish away before it. Who's the letter he's writing to, the person he's writing to? Does anybody know who that person in that image there is? Who? Yes, William Wilberforce, the man who ended slavery. So here you have the connection between practical holiness and real lived holiness. It's about doing things about your fellow man. And Wilberforce wins in England. He never gets to America. In America, a guy called Charles Finney, who I won't spend much time with because somebody else will, leads America in a religious revival against slavery. It's called, in American history, it's called the Second Great Awakening. Finney tours around telling people that your Christianity has to be lived practically. He's the guy who invented the sort of Billy Graham crusade idea. You know, goes around talking to vast crowds of people, gets them to come out to Jesus. And, well, look, I've got somebody else who explained that for us. If it'll work. Grant, can you help? Hang on, we go back one. Got to go back one. There, that should work. He's not moving. It did work when I tested it last night. Well, look, I'll tell you what he says. This man, does anybody know who Tony Campolo is? He's the man Bill Clinton called in when he got in trouble with Monica Lewinsky, and he said, I've got to have a pastor to, get me through all this. Tony Campolo became the Bill Clinton, father confessor. Tony Campolo had a great line in which he says that, look, when you got converted at a Finney rally, it wasn't like Billy Graham. When you went down the front and you knelt at the front in the Charles Finney rally, if you got up, you weren't actually patted on the head and said, go away and read your Bible and pray. They took you out to a back room and you were asked to sign up to support either the women's movement or the anti-slavery movement. Now, this is the 1840s we're talking about in America. The women's movement or the anti-slavery movement. And Campolo says, if you weren't prepared to sign up for either of those, Finney's response was, well, look, I think you better go away and have a think of it because you're perhaps not really ready to be a Christian. That Christianity had real, radical, practical implications. Campolo says it better than I, but I'm sorry about the little hiccup there. It's my fault. Preparing things late at night doesn't do you well. William and Catherine Booth were profoundly influenced by Charles Finney. Catherine was a very good speaker in her own right, and around England, the Methodist newspaper called Catherine Booth equated her to Charles Finney, and she then said, no, it's William, my husband, who's the English Charles Finney. So they adopted that same value. William and Catherine were Methodists, followers of Wesley. More than that, they joined a part of the Wesleyan church called the Methodist New Connection. That is, they were emphasising, as Wesley did, this global connectedness, that Christianity had to work in the world practically. It was part of that historic role that Christianity had had for 1,600 years in claiming a place in the marketplace, in civil society. Now we get to some difficulties that faced the Salvos. William Stead was an English journalist, and he first encountered the Salvation Army when, as a young newspaper editor up north in Darlington, two young Salvo officers came to town, they were girls, and William Booth put them to work saving coal miners, and Stead was outraged by that. And he said, how dare you send young women into physical and moral danger? And Booth responded by saying, you'd not make much of a general, unwilling to risk your troops. And a healthy correspondence ensued. But this is Stead's view of the world. In the world's great field of battle, no duty is higher than to keep the ranks of the forces of light well filled with recruits. It's to no holiday that our offspring are called, rather it's a combat long and stern, ending in inevitable death. Oh, gee, that's inspirational, isn't it? But Stead actually believed it. He was a Congregationalist Christian who really believed the job of the Christian was to get into war against poverty, vice, evil, and not just moral questions, but social questions. And he was a great social agitator in Britain. He's regarded as the founder, he's regarded by journalist historians as the founder of modern journalism. He was the one who invented the headline. He was the one who invented putting pictures on the front page of the newspapers. He was the one who invented what Australian television has made an art form, that is the sting. You know, sending out a journalist to stick a microphone in the face of some corrupt individual. Stead was the one who invented that. He didn't have microphones. He did it with print. And do you know that the Salvation Army was centrally involved in Stead's first great newspaper sting? The sort of history of tabloid journalism in the world begins with the Salvation Army, and I do not exaggerate. Let me tell you the story, because it goes to something that I think is critical for us today. One of the people that Stead enlisted to help him in this latest crusade was a woman called Josephine Butler. And Josephine Butler was again a committed Christian. She was an Anglican, but she was leading the cause of working with women who'd been caught in prostitution. And she wasn't a moraliser. Now, this is really interesting. We're talking about the 1860s here. Josephine Butler, this very refined, beautiful, everyone was in love with Josephine Butler, beautiful Anglican woman, got involved in a crusade, and she linked with Catherine Booth, William's wife, in a thing called the Midnight Movement. And what the aim was to change the law in England, because the way that the law in England was constructed was that if you were a bloke looking to solicit a prostitute for the night, you could go out and pay your money, do whatever you needed to. Law couldn't touch you. If the woman accepted payment, she was immediately guilty. Blokes weren't guilty, women were. But Josephine Butler said, but hang on, why are these women in the conditions they are? Because quite often they've been put there by either being beaten by their husbands or in situations where they can't work because men have the right. Women have no rights, yet they're the guilty people. Because in those days, women were legally regarded as chattels of their husband. So the person who has no rights in the situation is made the guilty party. Didn't seem right to Josephine Butler, didn't seem right to Catherine Booth. So they got together and worked on a thing called the Midnight Movement to get the law changed in England to shift the blame onto the man who was soliciting rather than the prostitute who was the victim. So there was a little history there. Stead, being the great crusader he was, knew both Josephine Butler and he knew Catherine Booth because of the correspondence that he'd been having with William over a few years. The big issue which troubled Stead was that, OK, you're dealing with the women issue, what about children? And Stead, together with some others, a group of parliamentarians and a few others, uncovered the fact that there were hundreds of thousands of homeless kids being dragged into child prostitution, and the law couldn't touch them because the age of consent was so low, it was about 11 or 12, that there was virtually no way that the issue could be dealt with. So Stead decided, and what's more, the establishment denied it. Now, again, history repeats itself. If you follow the newspapers in Britain, one of the continuing stories over the last 2 or 3 years is the way parliamentarians have been caught, some of them in a pedophile ring. But in those days, it wasn't a crime, so we're not talking about it. But it was widespread. Stead enlisted the Booths in a campaign that became known as the Maiden Tribute Campaign. He enlisted Josephine Butler, Catherine Booth, and he used as his principal agent and assistant in this campaign. Where is the... There's Josephine Butler. She's a bit older than she was in the earlier photo. Catherine Booth. We get another one here. Now, this is an interesting one. We're talking in days when Protestants and Catholics didn't talk to each other. Cardinal Manning, the head of the Catholic Church in England, came in and joined a committee that Stead was organising on this. Cardinal Manning had been a rich aristocrat, but he decided to go... he became an Anglican clergyman, fighting for the poor in the slums in much the same way as Booth had done. He then converted to Catholicism and took this crusading for the poor into his life as a Catholic priest and rose quickly and became eventually the cardinal, the head of the Catholic Church in Britain. He's the one who, if you go to Westminster near the Houses of Parliament and you go past Westminster Abbey and you walk down the street away, there's Westminster Cathedral, the Catholic cathedral in England. It was Cardinal Manning who got Westminster Cathedral built. He's one of the great heroes of the English Church. He came in and supported this. The other person who was the chief operator of this little action with Stead was this guy, and this is Bramwell Booth, William Booth's son. And it was William and Catherine linked with Josephine Butler who actually were the policy engines behind what Stead did. What they did, and some of you'll know this story, so I'll tell it to you briefly, is they decided to show that you could purchase a kid for the purposes of prostitution. They got hold of a reformed brothel keeper called Rebecca Jarrett, who'd become a member of the Salvation Army. She said, yeah, I know how this is done. So Stead set her up in a room, a shop, and Rebecca Jarrett made sure that it was known that she was looking to purchase a child for the purposes of prostitution, and sooner or later a woman came in with a daughter ready to sell her. Stead is in the room sort of making notes, he's hidden making notes about the whole transaction. It takes place, the little child is taken through a back door, given to a woman Salvation Army officer, taken down the back stairs and whisked off across the channel to a Salvation Army children's home in France where she's kept under protection. Stead writes up this big story in the newspaper and publishes it as Maiden Tribute in Modern Babylon. It becomes a sensation. It's like, you know, Channel 7 today or Channel 9, Current Affair, doing one of those sting operations. Stead does it with the Salvation Army in the 1890s. He runs it as a massive newspaper campaign. All sorts of people get involved. George Bernard Shaw, a young writer, races down, grabs as many copies of Stead's newspaper as he can, takes it down the street, helps people sell it. The Salvation Army then wheels out its big guns. It gets a national campaign petition launched, and the petition gets over 300,000 signatures in a couple of weeks, and they didn't just present it to Parliament House. Bramwell Booth hires a cart, and they get this petition rolled up as giant rolls like toilet paper, rolled up to take it down to the House of Commons and unroll it. They proposed to unroll it down the floor of the House of Commons. Well, it didn't quite get to that. The parliamentarians were so scared they quickly passed an act which raised the age of consent. Then a competitor newspaper of Stead's reveals that the whole thing has been a stunt. That is, that Stead set the operation up, that it was a scam, entrapment. Stead and Bramwell Booth are then and Rebecca Jarrett are charged for violating the law on the issue. They go to court. Stead is found guilty, sentenced to jail. Rebecca Jarrett is found guilty, sentenced to jail. Bramwell Booth, who is also in the dock with them, gets let off because he actually wasn't in the room when the transaction took place. He was outside down the street doing something else, organising. So you have an example where we've got newspaper history broken, we've got legal history established, the Criminal Law Amendment Act is passed, but the people who succeed didn't get it passed go to jail. That became another sensation, and even the great Cecil Rhodes of Rhodesia comes across to England to visit and pays Stead a visit in Hollywood at Holloway Jail to make sure Stead's okay. Stead became a national hero overnight with some. With others, he became damned for all time. George Bernard Shaw felt he'd been suckered and he refused to speak to Stead for the rest of his life. So any time you see a reference to George Bernard Shaw and W.T. Stead, you'll always see George Bernard Shaw writing really, really bad things about Stead. He called him a lunatic, a raver, and he couldn't get over the fact that he'd fallen for it. But they got the law changed. Cardinal Manning supported Stead and Bramwell right through the whole thing. The Catholic cardinal stood with the Salvation Army right through the whole thing. Why do I raise this now? Stead became a prisoner. He became proud of his prison. That's a photograph of him as he was put into jail. This is a photograph of him for the rest of his life. Every year on the anniversary of him being put into jail, he'd put on his prison uniform. Just to prove that he could do it, of course. I think he was trying to make a point. Now, the interesting thing is that William Booth had nothing to do with any of this. Any of the histories written about this, including the officially approved biography of William Booth, written in the 1920s, doesn't mention William in conjunction with the maiden tribute campaign. The people who are mentioned are Bramwell Booth, his son, and Catherine Booth, his wife. And a number of people have pondered this over the years and said, why wouldn't William get involved? In fact, it's worse than that. William was very uneasy about the whole thing. He didn't think it ought to happen. He was just really uncomfortable with it. Because William Booth was wrestling with an issue that the Salvation Army and churches are still wrestling with today. That is it the job of churches to save souls, or is it the job of churches to transform and change society? And you must have heard it. You know, you hear these evangelicals saying, no, our only job is to save souls, and we get them in and put them in the heavenly lifeboat, and God will take them to heaven, and the world is going to hell in a handbasket, so the world's got to be left to itself. That's a form of evangelicalism which has dominated Protestant Christianity for the last 150 years. If you go back to the time of Wesley, where the Booths took their inspiration from, in the 1840s, the 1830s and back into the 1780s, no, evangelicalism is saying you get transformed, then you get about the business of transforming the world. And that Christianity has an obligation to actually build the good society. William Booth knew that. But he was troubled, and the reason I'm spending time on this is it's still an argument today. What does the church have to do with social work? William Booth had grown up in a tradition where he said, yes, I've got to care for the poor. He supported working with the poor and underprivileged, but he believed in doing it by saying, I'll convert the individual. Then when they become changed by the Spirit of God, they can then go about changing their neighbourhood place by place. Others said to William, yes, that is right, but because social institutions are created by people, social institutions are also marked by the stain of corruption. And that is, you might have good people, but corrupt institutions can knock them over. And that took a lot of argument. And William Booth wrestled with this issue in his own mind, and for the next 5 years, between 1885 and 1890, William Booth personally had a real struggle with this, till in 1889, well 4 years, 1889, he publishes a little article in the Salvation Army publication of the War Cry called Salvation for Both Worlds. And he works it through in his own head eventually and says, my responsibility for the poor, yes, is about personally converting them. I can do the Billy Graham thing. But unless I deal also with the things that are making the poor poor, I could be wasting my time. I've got to deal with both. I've got to deal with the things that turn people to crime as well as helping the criminal. Took him a while to get there, but once he gets there, he buys it completely. And over the next 2 years, he puts himself to work with Stead, the man who had led the Maiden Tribute campaign, and with Catherine, who by this time is dying of breast cancer. And what they do is they set up a study beside Catherine's bedroom. And in that room, in that study, beside Catherine's bedroom, they come up with the idea that I referred to at the start of the Darkest England scheme. We've got to be about changing the structures as well as saving the souls. And the story goes that as Stead and William would write the manuscript in the room, they'd take the sheaths of paper into Catherine and she'd go through and say, I agree with this, I don't agree with that, I agree with this, and rewrite it, and it would then come back, and Stead would take Catherine's version and William's version and turn them into reasonable journalism. So you have here the story of people genuinely wrestling with an issue that you still find disturbs us today. and this is where I go back to the start, George Brandis and Malcolm Fraser, both on the same side in politics, a few years apart. Brandis' argument about Christians' role in civilisation was the role about you change the individual, then that individual gets on with changing the world. Malcolm Fraser's argument was, no, the individual has to be responsible for the structure of the social institutions, and we have to be involved in reforming institutions as much as we do in reforming individuals. This is, and what I'm saying is it's a non-party issue. I'm not making a left-right argument here, I'm making a theological argument. People tend to try and make it a political argument. And it does become a political argument, but it's a different point that I'm making. Must move on. Don't want to bore you too long. At the time, kids were suffering, as I said. The Maiden Tribute campaign was one of the only aspects. The other aspect was laws. Kids as young as 6 and 7, 8 and 9 could be in factories working. One of the people who saved them was the Earl of Shaftesbury. Interestingly, an aristocrat, but a convinced Wesleyan. He believed in Wesley's view that I'm responsible for my neighbour. I've got to actually help change the world. The other person influenced at this time was the British Prime Minister, William Ewart Gladstone. We're talking about the 1880s here. Stead was responsible for bringing Gladstone, convincing Gladstone to come out of retirement and fight once again to become British Prime Minister, which he did. Stead had enormous influence with these people. The other person, strangely enough, who gets into the picture here, this isn't Cardinal Manning. This is Cardinal Manning's boss, Pope Leo XIII, over in Rome. William Booth, in 1890, publishes In Darkest England in the Way Out, in October 1890. In May 1891, the Catholic Church... Whoops, I'll skip on, I don't need to talk about that. William Booth publishes In Darkest England, The Way Out, in, as I said, October 1890. In May 1891, Pope Leo XIII in Rome issues Rerum Novarum. For those of you who don't know, Rerum Novarum is still regarded today as the foundational teaching of Catholic social theology. It's still quoted today. Pope Francis, again, where are we now? Pope Francis is leaning on the teachings of Rerum Novarum to push through reforms in the Catholic Church, or not reforms yet, attitudinal changes in the Catholic Church. Attitudinal changes which put the victim at the heart of the story. That goes back to Rerum Novarum in 1891. Why am I making this point? Because more than one Catholic commentator say that the key advisor to Leo XIII when it came to Rerum Novarum was Cardinal Manning. Cardinal Manning at this stage had been, for those 3 or 4 years following the Maiden Tribute campaign, increasingly close to the Booths, particularly Bramwell Booth. This is very strange. We're talking about a gap between the Protestants and the Catholics here in a time when they don't talk. Bramwell Booth, in his biography called Echoes and Memories, talks about, he gives a page to talking about Cardinal Manning and the profound influence that they had on each other and the talks he enjoyed having with Cardinal Manning. So we're talking about here moments in history which are world-changing. People say, oh, the Salvation Army's Darkest England scheme. Yeah, so what? So what? It was part of a sea change in the way people saw religion relating to the world, and a change that wasn't just about this small organisation called the Salvation Army. It's got impacts right across. Who knows what those days and weeks and talking with Manning and Booth and the others, the impact that had on Rerum Novarum, which now influences profoundly millions and millions of Catholics around the world and is helping Pope Francis reshape Catholicism. All that proves is, look, you're not entirely wasting your time when you're sitting around having cups of coffee talking about the way things should be. Because from little things, big things may grow. Now, how did William Booth come to resolve this issue? I don't know. We don't know. We know he worked it through. He worked it through to the point where he said, when somebody challenged him on this connection between evangelicalism and socialism, social reform rather than socialism, social reform, he said they are Siamese twins. To kill one is to slay them both. That is, unless I'm concerned about society, I can't really be concerned about the individual. Yes, if the individual isn't transformed, no amount of changing society is going to help because individuals will always be corrupt. But unless I change society, I can't really help the individual because society, the social institutions, will corrupt the individual. You've got to do both. Duh. Don Burke is currently the head of the Salvation Army's college in Canada, the University College in Canada. He had this take on it. Soldiers, that is members of the Salvation Army, this is a quote from him last year in Australia. Soldiers have often been led to think that our social mission is merely a means to an evangelical end. That is, we look after their bodies in order to get to their souls. However, William Booth's vision reaches back through Wesleyan theology to the heart of the biblical tradition. It is found in the Hebrew word shalom. We do not look after bodies simply to save souls. We care for the world because God loves the world. We care for people because God loves all people, and we do justice because God wants the best for the world. That is a terrific summary, not just of the purpose of the Salvation Army, but of the purpose of Christianity in the world, as an agent in civil society. The beauty of it is it's an agency that can be expressed either individually or corporately. And the tension is which one you use at which particular time. That's not a principal question, it's a tactical question. Don't get hung up about it, you just decide pragmatically which is the best approach to this, to work with individuals or to start agitating government. It's not an either or, it's an and both. Just to give you a little tag end. Stead finished his career gloriously. He went down on the Titanic. And that's one of the newspaper headlines from the day, the New York Herald, the day the Titanic sinks, and there's Stead's photo right in the centre of it. That's how famous the man was. And there's his photo in the Daily Mail in London as one of the people who went down on the Titanic. The same year, 1912, a little later, William Booth died. So they both died in the same year. General Booth Memorial Number Special Interest issue, and that's William Booth's funeral, which is a gigantic funeral. That same year was also a big year for the Brits in funerals, because that was the year that Scott perished in the Antarctic. So you had these three massive funerals, and two of them associated with sort of technological disasters. Scott and British imperialism, the great British hero dies in the Antarctic, and the Titanic goes down. There's a bit of a shock to British self-confidence. And then, shortly after that, you get the horrors that Hitchens referred to earlier of the First World War. In the First World War, you had millions die, and it seemed that this whole Christian project was a waste of time. And people began to get disenchanted. The great disenchantment with the church in the world begins around 1912 and ends in 1918, and then begins to grow as people begin to lose confidence in churches and their role. What's really very interesting about all this is what the church did was came up with this idea, well, look, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. Our only job is to put people in the heavenly lifeboat. We haven't got any responsibility to transform the world. And that argument has bedevilled churches ever since. For the last 100 years, the churches have got stuck into that argument that, we've got to forget about the world because it doesn't work anyway, we're complete failures. And that's what allows people like Hitchens in the door. Now, I happen to agree with much of what Hitchens has said on these issues. And I referred earlier to Philip Jenkins' book, The Great and Holy War, which says that really churches themselves were so confident in the way they were going to change the world that they actually got involved in supporting the militaries of both sides in the First World War in a fairly disgraceful form. God on our side, said the Germans, and the English and the Americans said much the same thing. Those who thought that the church had to get out of the world. They were convinced when, would you believe, the British troops towards the end of the war invaded Palestine and took over Jerusalem from the Muslims. Led by General Allenby, a British general. The troops who led him in, who are in that photograph at the bottom, as Allenby walks into Jerusalem, are Australians. It was the Australians coming up from Beersheba and other places that helped Allenby take Jerusalem. And this was the biblical conservatives thought, oh, this is proof of prophecy that the world is doomed, but we're taking Jerusalem so God will triumph. Now, as I said, Americans began particularly to think about God in ways, because they had all these little churches that will enable them to say, oh, look, we'll just look after ourselves and we'll forget the world. There's a terrific book came out about this a couple of years ago called American Jesus by a guy called Stephen Prothero, who's a professor of religion at Boston University. And what you see there is an actual real photo. And you see Jesus there as a big hot air balloon. He's flying over a little town there. What Stephen Prothero is saying is that in America, Jesus has become whatever hot air you want to fill him with. And I think that's been pretty accurate about the mess that Christianity has found itself in around the world, particularly evangelical Christianity. That's a close-up of that same little town. I think that's one of those covers that you don't need to read the book. After you've seen the cover, you unpack the cover, you understand the book. It's just terrific. I'm going to skip on here because, well, let me indulge in a bit of politics. In the 1980s, this was given a real kick along, this idea that it's all, you can let the world go, it's all about individuals. When Ronald Reagan, when he became president, said this, in the present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. That is, it's all up to the individual. You don't need to worry about social structures. He was closely followed politically by Margaret Thatcher in England, who said there's no such thing as society. There are individual men and women and there are families. Well, gosh, gee, what about our schools? What about our railways? What about the infrastructure of our society? So in the last 30 years, society has begun to reflect this Christian withdrawal by withdrawing itself. So society has become very much more individualised. It's all about us. It's not about we anymore. It's all about me. And would you believe the church has followed along on that? I'll tell you why. This guy, Robert Putnam, published a book about 20 years ago after the Reagan-Thatcher stuff, in which he discovered that social institutions, surprise to surprise, were beginning to crumble. And he called the phenomenon in America bowling alone. That is, you no longer bowl with groups, you bowl by yourself. It's just about me. It's just about me. An American sociologist called Peter Berger said, in fact, the church is simply repeating the Martin Luther experience. That is, the church is now going around, as Martin Luther did, or the opponents of Martin Luther. You remember I told you the story about this priest who was going around saying, if you give me 100 florins, I'll guarantee your parents can get out of hell. Peter Berger says in America these days, it's not the Catholics, it's the Protestants who are doing it. You send me $50 to the TV set, and I'll guarantee you the Lord will bless you. You can make $1 million just by sending me $20. It's called the prosperity gospel. The what about me Christianity. The Christianity that looks about, Jesus as my personal life coach. It's a repeat of what split the church 500 years ago. It's reflected in society that's bowling alone. Putnam also wrote another book just 3 or 4 years ago called American Grace. And he says, isn't as much as churches are the problem, and he's not a Christian. He said, when you look around, it's churches who are providing the resource for civil society to rediscover its connection. That we are responsible for our neighbours. And that Putnam found that wherever there were signs of a re-emergence of community responsibility rather than just this Me Too business, it was coming out of church communities who are looking back to that tradition that I've outlined to you today. Geraldine Doog, a colleague of mine at ABC TV, interviewed a Catholic nun I hope this one works, a Catholic nun a couple of months ago on Compass, Sister Susan Connolly, she had this to say. No! That's not Susan Connolly. It's not going to work. Susan Connolly said, I belong to a church tradition that said souls matter and bodies matter. I'm thinking I'm listening to William Booth. And she outlined, quoting, not rerum novarum, but paraphrasing rerum novarum in a way that could have been a direct paraphrase of William Booth in the Darkest England scheme. Skip on from that. Bettany Hughes is a professor of history in the UK. She's making a new television series which will doubtless screen on Australian television next year because she looks good. And we like, women who look good talking heavy stuff. It's really good. So Bettany will make a reappearance on Australian TV. She gave the Hugh Weldon lecture in the BBC for the BBC a couple of years ago, and what was the topic she chose? The civilising role of Christianity. And she's a secular historian. She's not making a religious point. She's making a point about the set of values that emerged out of it. These guys are theologians from two completely different traditions. One is Professor Stephen Bevan, who's a professor of missiology and culture at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. The other is Dr. Darrell Gouda, professor of missiology at Princeton. Princeton's hardcore Protestant, Catholic Theological Union, hardcore Catholic. Both of them are saying the same thing, that the job of the church these days is to leave the building. That churches are too obsessed with what's going inside their own congregations. What they've got to do is remember that they exist for others. Bingo. Others. That what goes on inside the building really ultimately is not relevant unless it's directed outwards. And that doesn't mean going and lecturing people necessarily about, saving your soul. That might be the ultimate aim. But the real point for a society today that has to be concerned with the sorts of crises we're seeing emerging is, what are we doing about the state of the world, the state of the planet? What are we doing about the environment? What are we doing about the things that are falling apart around us? Both of these guys are saying this from opposite ends of the intellectual spectrum. They trace their interest in this and their enlightenment, both of them, back to a South African guy, a guy called David Bosch, who wrote a book called Transforming Missions. And the book, I'm not suggesting you read it unless you're interested, it's about that thick. It's still available in paperback. But he actually does the detailed stuff that I've just presented to you in summary. He goes in this really detailed theological analysis of everything I've been saying today. And Bosch's book is now underpinning both Protestant and theological insights into where the church is in society today. Where does Bosch get it from? Bosch grew up in South Africa in the midst of the fight against apartheid. He gets his inspiration from people like Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela. And Bosch comes out of that tradition. That the church in South Africa was really interesting. The church was the backbone of the apartheid system. The African Reformed Church supported apartheid. But it was also the church, particularly through the Methodist Church and the Catholic Church, who were the backbone of the anti-apartheid movement. Both groups appealed to the same stories. The Afrikaners appealed to the story of Moses leading the children of Israel out of bondage in Egypt because of their tradition as Dutch immigrants persecuted by the British, who had to load up their wagon trains and drive north up into what they called the Orange Free State so they could be free Dutch Afrikaners. The black Africans used that same story, Moses leading the children of Israel out of bondage, as their story of escape from slavery and bondage under the whites. And a few theologians on the white side and people like Tutu on the black side got together and said, we can teach both communities a lesson here. And they used that biblical story to bring apartheid to an end. Where are we today? Well, I started with a quote from Christopher Hitchens, so let me finish with a quote from an arch atheist about the state of the world. And he says this: George Orwell, the man who wrote 1984 and Animal Farm, and those sort of books, George Orwell, another convinced atheist, wrote that the problem, and George Orwell was writing in the late 1940s, George Orwell wrote that the problem of civilization would be exactly this. He said, how will we now inoculate ethics, teach morality to people, to the majority, in the absence of a spiritual authority that commands respect and that has innate presence, that has this respect? With this decline in the authority of religion, how shall we now teach ethics and morals? And Hitchens says, that's a very good question. And then Hitchens says, but if you go around the public halls and the provincial theatres, as I do whenever I can, and engage with belief and believers, you'll find to an extraordinary extent that a kind of ethical humanism and vague spiritual content is extremely commonplace and growing. The church has left the building. It still finds its essence in that story about a man crucified for doing good. And I'll end with my favourite quote, which people always ask me to repeat to them. When Stead was in prison over the Darkest England scheme, he actually offered this observation in a letter he wrote to his daughter Estelle. Do you know what I think Jesus Christ would do if he came now? He would go to church and chapel ever so many times and listen, and no one would speak to him. He would look to see who sat around him, and he would see no ragged people, no thieves, no harlots, only respectable people. And he would hear all these respectable people singing hymns to Christ and giving all the glory to Christ. And then after standing it a long time, Jesus would stand up someday in the middle of the church and say just two words, damn Christ. And then he would go out and go down some slum and put his arms around the neck of some poor lost orphan girl who was having a bitter cry and say, come unto me, all ye that are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. The hardest cross Christ has to bear is the cross that is made of those who call themselves his own church. Shortly after he writes, never tell anyone to be a Christian, always tell them to be Christ. It's true whether you're in the building or out. Thanks very much.